Introduction. The fire you've been avoiding. There's a moment that comes for every person who is serious about change. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or a clear sign from the universe. It shows up quietly, usually on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, as a feeling you can no longer push down. This isn't working. Maybe you're lying in bed at 6:47 a.m., already dreading the alarm. Maybe you're driving the same route to the same job, watching the same people rush past the same intersections in the same city. Maybe you've had the same argument with yourself for the 1,000th time. Tomorrow I'll start. Tomorrow I'll change. Tomorrow I'll become the person I know I could be. But tomorrow keeps becoming today, and today keeps becoming yesterday. And the version of you that exists in your imagination, disciplined, fearless, clear, keeps getting pushed further and further out of reach. Here is what nobody tells you about personal transformation. It doesn't begin with a new habit or a new morning routine or a new vision board. It begins with a death. The death of who you used to be. The old you? The one built from other people's expectations, from years of avoiding discomfort, from settling and rationalizing and staying quiet when you should have spoken up. That version of you has to go. Not wounded, not temporarily set aside. Gone. This is not a self-help book in the traditional sense. You won't find cheerful affirmations here or a 21-day challenge that promises to rewire your brain while you sleep. What you will find is something more valuable and more difficult. The truth about what transformation actually requires. It requires burning bridges. It requires sitting with discomfort so intense that every cell in your body screams for you to retreat to familiar territory. It requires looking at the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself for years and choosing, consciously, to stop believing them. It requires, above all else, the willingness to let the old you die so the real you can finally live. This book was written for Americans who are tired of being spectators in their own lives, for people who have watched their dreams slowly calcify into regrets, for anyone who has sensed, somewhere deep in their chest, that they are capable of something far greater than what they've allowed themselves to become. The path ahead is not easy, but it is yours to walk, and it starts right here. Burn the bridges. Why moving forward means destroying the road back. Marcus grew up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who spent 37 years on the same production line at an auto plant. His father was a good man, patient, loyal, hard-working. But Marcus noticed early on that his father never spoke about dreams, only duties. When Marcus told him at 16 that he wanted to become an architect, his father didn't laugh. He just looked up from his newspaper with tired eyes and said, "That's not for people like us, son." Marcus believed him for 18 years. He took a job at a logistics company. He showed up, did the work, came home. He dated the same kind of women, had the same kind of weekends, told the same kind of jokes at the same kind of bars. He was, by every external measure, fine. But at 34, sitting in his car in the parking garage of the office building where he'd worked for 11 years, he couldn't make himself get out. Not because he was afraid, because he finally understood something. He had been living someone else's life, and the longer he waited to change, the more of his real life he was surrendering. That day, Marcus made a decision that most people never find the courage to make. He decided to stop honoring the version of himself that had been built by fear, by other people's ceilings, by a lifetime of choosing safety over truth. He decided to burn the bridges. What does it mean to burn your bridges? In the conventional sense, burning bridges is a warning, a metaphor for reckless action, for damaging relationships that might one day prove useful. But in the context of personal transformation, burning bridges is not recklessness, it is clarity. It means removing the possibility of retreat. When you leave a door open to your old life, when you keep one foot in the past, when you maintain the friendships that drag you backward, when you preserve the habits that kept you small, you are guaranteeing that you will eventually step back through that door. Because change is hard and comfort is seductive, and the brain always prefers the familiar. The bridge back to who you were is not a safety net. It is a trap. Think about the weight you carry when you cling to your past. Every argument you've lost but can't stop replaying. Every relationship that ended badly but still occupies real estate in your mind. Every opportunity you let slip by because you were too afraid, too tired, too convinced you weren't ready. You carry all of it like a backpack full of rocks, walking toward a future you say you want, wondering why the journey feels so impossibly heavy. Here is the hard truth. You chose that weight, and you can choose to set it down. Letting go of the past doesn't require closure. This is one of the great myths of the self-improvement industry. The idea that you need a final conversation, a grand reconciliation, a neat and tidy ending before you can move forward. You don't. What happened has happened. It is finished. The only thing standing between you and your future is your insistence on carrying your past. The version of you that stayed too long, trusted the wrong people, made decisions you regret. That person was doing their best with what they had at the time. Honor them by learning from them. But don't let them drive. The people problem. Some of the hardest bridges to burn aren't made of habits or beliefs. They're made of people. When you begin to grow, genuinely grow, not just talk about growing, you will discover something uncomfortable. Not everyone in your life wants you to succeed. This isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's simply human. When you change, you implicitly challenge everyone around you who hasn't. Your growth is a mirror that shows them what's possible and what they've been avoiding. And some people would rather break the mirror than examine what it reflects. The friend who has known you since high school and still introduces you by the nickname that makes you cringe. The family member who responds to every new ambition with a story about someone who tried the same thing and failed. The coworker who jokes about your goals with just enough edge to make you feel ridiculous for having them. These people are not necessarily bad, but they are holding anchors, and if you let them, they will keep you stationary while you watch the tide go out. Distancing yourself from people who don't honor your growth is not betrayal. It is not arrogance. It is a necessary act of self-preservation. You are not obligated to sacrifice your future on the altar of other people's comfort. The people who belong in your next chapter will recognize you there. They won't need you to shrink back to a version of yourself they remember. They will meet the version of you that's still becoming. The guilt trap. Many people remain stuck in their past, not because they don't see a way forward, but because they feel guilty about leaving. Guilty for the mistakes they've made, guilty for the people they've disappointed, guilty for wanting more than what they have. Guilt, in its proper form, is a useful signal. It tells you when your actions have violated your own values, a prompt to correct course and do better. But guilt that has curdled into self-punishment is not useful. It is just suffering in disguise. You are allowed to have made mistakes and still be worthy of a better life. You are allowed to have been wrong and still deserve to be right about yourself now. You are allowed to have hurt people and to have genuinely reckoned with that and still choose to move forward. Forgiving yourself is not the same as excusing yourself. It means acknowledging what happened, absorbing the lesson, and releasing the need to keep paying for it. The debt is settled. The class is over. You can walk out of the schoolhouse now. The road behind you is not your home. It is your history. The ritual of release. In many indigenous American traditions, there is a practice of creating something, a piece of wood, a bundle of herbs, a drawing that represents what you wish to release, and then ceremonially burning it. The act is not symbolic in the decorative sense. It is transformative. The physical act of letting something burn creates a psychological reality. This thing is gone. You don't need to light anything on fire, but you do need the equivalent internal clarity. Find what it means for you to say, with complete intention, "I am no longer that person. That chapter is closed. This is who I am, becoming," and then act as though it's true, because it is. Marcus, the man from Detroit, eventually did become an architect. Not right away. It took 5 years of evening classes, missed social events, and the quiet accumulation of small daily choices. But more importantly, he became something even harder to achieve, a man who stopped waiting for permission to want what he wanted. The day he burned the bridge back to his old life, the day he stopped honoring his father's limitation as though it were a genetic inheritance, was the day his real life began. Yours can, too. The power of walking alone. Why solitude is not loneliness, it is freedom. There is a particular terror that seizes most people at the thought of being truly alone. Not physically isolated, that's a different fear, but genuinely independent, standing outside the approval of others, moving in a direction that no one around you understands or endorses. We are social animals, and the pull toward belonging is ancient and powerful. But somewhere in the long evolution of human culture, this healthy need for connection got twisted into something more dangerous, the compulsive need for validation. The difference between connection and validation is the difference between nourishment and addiction. Connection feeds you, validation consumes you. When your choices depend on what other people think of them, you are not free. You are outsourcing the most important decisions of your life to people who are, at best, running their own confusions and, at worst, unconsciously threatened by yours. The path to becoming your most powerful self runs, at some point, directly through the territory of solitude. Not permanent isolation. That is its own kind of avoidance. But the willingness to walk alone when walking alone is what the journey requires. The noise problem Elena had spent most of her adult life surrounded by people. Growing up in a large Cuban-American family in Miami, silence was practically a foreign concept. There was always someone in the kitchen, always a cousin calling from the other room, always another family gathering where opinions flowed as freely as the coffee. She was 31 years old before she spent a weekend entirely alone for the first time. It was not peaceful at first. The silence was almost physically uncomfortable. Her mind filled the space with noise. Worries she'd been too busy to notice, questions she'd been too surrounded to ask herself. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually want, separate from what my family expects? By the end of the weekend, she had not answered all of those questions, but she had found something more valuable: the ability to hear them clearly. Most people never ask themselves the questions that matter most about their own lives, not because the answers are unavailable, but because they've never created the silence in which those questions can be heard. Solitude as a training ground. Every serious athlete understands that competition is only half the story. The other half, the invisible half, happens in training. The early mornings when nobody is watching. The hours of deliberate practice that produce no visible result until, suddenly, they produce everything. The same is true of psychological and spiritual development. The great figures of American history who transformed their fields, the entrepreneurs, the artists, the leaders who genuinely changed things, nearly all had periods of deep solitude embedded in their story. Abraham Lincoln, reading by firelight in a log cabin, digesting everything he could find. Nikola Tesla, spending months in isolation, working through problems that others had declared unsolvable. Toni Morrison, writing before dawn while her children slept, in the hours when no one needed her to be anyone other than herself. These were not accidents of circumstance. They were deliberate choices, the recognition that certain kinds of growth require space that the noise of daily life cannot provide. When you remove the constant input of other people's opinions, expectations, and anxieties, you create room for something extraordinary, your own thinking to emerge. Not the thoughts you have in response to other people's thoughts, not the ambitions filtered through what seems acceptable to your social circle. Your actual thoughts, your actual ambitions, the ones you've been too distracted or too afraid to notice. Why other people's presence can keep you small. This is delicate territory because it can easily slide into arrogance or misanthropy, and that is not the point. The point is more precise. When you are constantly embedded in other people's energy, you are constantly absorbing their limitations along with their strengths. The friend who has accepted that life is hard and success is for other people will subtly inoculate you against ambition, not through any malicious intent, but simply through the transmission of their own resigned worldview. The family member who has never left the city, never started the business, never made the leap, their presence carries an unspoken argument. See, it's fine here. This is what life looks like. Don't go too far. And because we are wired for belonging, we often comply, not consciously, but in 1,000 small surrenders, a dream dialed down here, an ambition quietly shelved there. We make ourselves comfortable in cages we helped build. Solitude breaks the spell. When you spend genuine time alone, not scrolling through other people's lives, not filling the silence with background noise, but actually alone with your own thoughts, you discover something liberating. Your inner landscape is larger and stranger and more interesting than anything you've been allowed to explore while living for other people's comfort. The responsibility of aloneness. There is a trade-off in choosing to walk alone when you are independent, genuinely independent, not just performing independence. There is no one to blame when things go wrong. The excuses that external validation requires become unavailable. This is exactly why most people avoid it. It is far more comfortable to frame your life as something that happens to you. The economy, the timing, the city you grew up in, the parents you were given. These are real factors. They matter. But when they become the entire story, you have handed your power to forces you cannot change and surrendered your agency over the only thing you actually control, what you do next. Walking alone means accepting full ownership of your choices. The failures are yours. So are the victories. So is the direction. This kind of ownership can feel crushing at first, but it is, in fact, the only foundation on which a real life can be built. The wolves in the wild don't hunt in committees. They don't wait for group consensus before they move. They are efficient, focused, and self-directed, capable of collective action when it serves them, but never dependent on the pack to define their worth. Be the wolf. Solitude is not the destination. One final clarification. Choosing solitude as a practice does not mean choosing isolation as a life. The goal is not to become a hermit, to cut yourself off from love, or to develop a philosophy of self-sufficiency so extreme that it calcifies into loneliness. The goal is to become someone who can function from their own center, who chooses connection because it enriches them rather than fleeing aloneness because it terrifies them. There is a vast difference between the person who surrounds themselves with people because they cannot stand the sound of their own thoughts and the person who chooses to be with others as a genuine expression of what they want. The first is running from something. The second is moving toward something. Develop the capacity to be alone, not to live there, but to visit regularly. Let it become familiar territory, a place you return to when you need to remember who you are, recalibrate your direction, or simply hear yourself think. The silence will not always be comfortable, but it will always be honest. And honesty, even when it's hard, is the only thing that leads anywhere worth going. The myth of comfort. How safety is quietly destroying your potential. Every city in America has a neighborhood where nothing ever changes. The same businesses on the same corners, the same rhythms, the same faces, the same conversations that seem to have been running since sometime in the previous century. You can drive through certain streets and feel as though time has simply stopped. Not in a charming way. In the way of a clock whose batteries went dead and nobody bothered to replace. Most people's internal lives look like that neighborhood. The conversations with themselves haven't changed in years. The beliefs about what's possible, what they deserve, what they're capable of, frozen in configurations that were set, in many cases, before they were old enough to drive. The same fears, the same ceiling, the same daily negotiations with a life that doesn't quite fit, conducted under the quiet assumption that fitting is for other people. This is the true cost of comfort. Not stagnation, that's just the symptom. The cost is the gradual, imperceptible erosion of what you could have become. Comfort as anesthetic. Consider what comfort actually does in the body. It reduces vigilance. It softens edges. It removes the neurological urgency that drives adaptation. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. The animal that is warm and fed and safe does not need to develop new capabilities. New capabilities are expensive. They require energy, risk, and the tolerance of discomfort. They are only worth developing when the alternative is worse. The problem is that your nervous system cannot distinguish between comfortable and dying and comfortable and thriving. It simply registers the absence of immediate threat and downshifts into maintenance mode. This is why so many people who are, by any objective measure, perfectly comfortable are also profoundly unfulfilled. They are not in danger. They are just not growing. And some part of them, the part that knows what they're actually capable of, registers this as a kind of death. Not dramatic, not sudden, slow, warm, and anesthetized. The parable of the fitness program. David was a high school football coach in Austin, Texas. Twice a week, he ran a conditioning program for his players that included what he called the discomfort circuit, a series of exercises specifically designed to bring athletes to the edge of what they believed they could tolerate, and then ask them to do one more set. He had a saying that his players eventually had tattooed on their wrists and painted on their bedroom walls. Growth is exactly as uncomfortable as it needs to be. What David understood, and what his players gradually internalized, is that the sensation of discomfort during genuine growth is not a warning sign. It is a signal, a notification from the body that says, "We are operating in unfamiliar territory. New pathways are being formed. This is development." The pain of the last set is not the body breaking down, it is the body building up. The same is true of psychological and emotional growth. The discomfort you feel when you have a hard conversation you've been avoiding is not damage, it is progress. The anxiety you experience when you commit to something that matters, before you know whether it will work, is not a problem, it is the price of admission. Every real achievement in your life was, at some point, uncomfortable. Every meaningful relationship required you to be vulnerable before you knew it would be safe to be vulnerable. Every significant skill you've developed required you to be bad at something before you got good at it. You have already proven, repeatedly, that discomfort is survivable. The question is whether you're willing to keep choosing it. the seduction of the comfortable lie. There is a particular kind of story we tell ourselves when we are avoiding growth, and it sounds remarkably reasonable. It sounds like wisdom. Now is not the right time. I need to be more prepared. Once things settle down, I'll be ready to make the move. I just need a few more months of stability. The comfortable lie is effective because it doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like prudence. It has the shape of patience and the voice of maturity. But underneath the reasonable language, it is doing something very specific. It is protecting the comfort zone by reframing inaction as strategy. The truth is simpler and less flattering. Most of us are not waiting for the right time. We are waiting for the fear to go away. And the fear does not go away. The fear is the signal. The fear is pointing directly at the thing that matters most. The distinction between people who change their lives and people who spend their lives meaning to change their lives is not intelligence or talent or circumstance or luck. It is the willingness to act while afraid. What the opposite of comfort actually feels like, James Baldwin wrote about leaving Harlem as a young man, about the terror and necessity of placing himself in unfamiliar, often hostile territory, because staying where he was would have meant the death of everything he was trying to become as a writer. He didn't leave because it was comfortable. He left because staying was a slower form of destruction. The decision to leave comfort is rarely exhilarating in the moment. It is usually terrifying. Your hands shake, your stomach tightens, your brain runs rapid fire through every way things could go wrong. This is normal. This is healthy. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do: assess risk, flag uncertainty, prepare for difficulty. The insight that transforms everything is this: that feeling is not a stop sign. It is a direction indicator. The thing that makes your heart race and your palms sweat. That's the edge of your comfort zone. That's exactly where growth lives. The warrior doesn't wait until there is no fear before stepping forward. The warrior steps forward because there is fear and because they have made a decision that their vision is more important than their comfort. You have that capacity. You've had it all along. The compound interest of discomfort. Here is the practical reality of choosing growth over comfort on a regular basis. It compounds. Every time you do the hard thing, make the difficult call, finish the work when you could have quit, face the truth you've been avoiding, you deposit something into an internal account. Not money, not metrics. Something more durable. Evidence. Evidence that you can tolerate discomfort and survive. Evidence that the fear was survivable. Evidence accumulated over hundreds of small daily choices that you are the kind of person who does what they said they would do. This evidence becomes your operating system. It changes how your nervous system responds to challenge. It rewires, literally, the neural pathways that govern your relationship with difficulty. The person who has consistently chosen growth over comfort for 2 years is not just more accomplished than they were 2 years ago. They are neurologically different. The discomfort that would have paralyzed them before now registers as familiar, as an old friend, the one that shows up when something important is happening. You don't get there by deciding once that you're going to be brave. You get there by making thousands of small decisions over time to keep choosing the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. Each of those decisions is a chip in the sculpture. Each one reveals a little more of the person underneath. Start today. Not because the timing is right, it won't be. Not because you feel ready, you won't. Start because the only moment you actually have is this one, and the only version of yourself who will ever benefit from the choice is the one standing here, right now, deciding. Rewiring the machine, the architecture of your mind and how to rebuild it. Picture the control room of a massive industrial facility somewhere in the American Midwest, the kind you see from the highway, lit up at night, processing thousands of operations per second. Pipes and switches and monitors everywhere. Workers moving efficiently between stations, responding to signals, making adjustments, keeping the whole complex system running. That is, roughly, what your mind looks like in operation. The signals come in constantly. From your environment, your memory, your body, your social interactions. They get processed through filters built from decades of experience, interpreted through a lens shaped by everything you've been told about yourself and the world, and converted into the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that constitute your daily experience. Here's the crucial detail. Most of that processing is automated. It runs on programs installed years ago, many of them before you were old enough to consent to the installation. The stories you were told about your worth and potential, the models of success and failure you absorbed from the people around you, the conclusions your 8-year-old self drew from situations your 38-year-old self is far more equipped to understand. All of it running quietly in the background, shaping what you notice, what you believe is possible, how you respond to threat and opportunity. If you want a different life, you have to update the software. The installed programs. Sarah grew up in a small city in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4 children. Her family wasn't poor, but money was always tight, and the unspoken message in the household was clear. Wanting too much leads to disappointment. Be realistic. Don't get your hopes up. That's not for people like us. By the time Sarah was in her late 20s, working as a paralegal and dreaming of law school, she noticed something strange. Every time she got close to applying, something would happen to derail her. A sudden financial emergency, a family crisis, a wave of crushing self-doubt that made the whole ambition feel childish. A quiet inner voice that said, "Who do you think you are?" She had internalized the program so completely that she was running it without knowing it. She wasn't being held back by circumstances. She was being held back by a belief system installed in a rural Ohio kitchen decades before, operating on autopilot. The moment she recognized that voice, not as hers, but as a borrowed thing, a hand-me-down from people who loved her but had their own unexamined limitations, everything changed. She applied to law school at 33. She graduated at 36. But the real transformation happened earlier, in the moment she realized she had the right to examine her own programming and decide for herself what to keep. The anatomy of a limiting belief. A limiting belief is not an obvious thing. It doesn't announce itself as a limitation. It presents as reality. I'm just not a numbers person. I'm terrible at relationships. I've never been athletic. I don't have the kind of mind that... These don't feel like choices. They feel like facts, neutral observations about a fixed self. But they are none of those things. They are stories, crystallized through repetition into the texture of truth. The mechanism is straightforward. Something happens. Your mind, in its efficient desire to create predictability, generates a story about what that thing means about you. You repeat that story, sometimes aloud, more often silently, until the neural pathway associated with it deepens into a groove. The groove becomes the default route. The default route becomes identity. I failed at this once. Therefore, I am someone who fails at this. Therefore, I won't try again. The 3-step erosion of possibility completed before breakfast. Awareness as the first tool. You cannot change what you cannot see. This is the first principle of psychological transformation, and it is both the most obvious and the most overlooked. Before you can update your internal programming, you have to be able to observe it. You have to develop the capacity to watch your own thoughts, not to judge them, not to fight them, but to notice them with enough distance to ask a simple question. Is this true, or is this just a story I've been telling myself? This practice of metacognition, thinking about thinking, is the foundational skill of psychological freedom. It creates a gap between stimulus and response, between the thought that arises and the belief you choose to hold, between the pattern that was installed and the pattern you decide to run. The thought comes, "I'm not good enough for this." The old response, automatic agreement, accompanied by a retreat from the challenge. The new response, "I notice that thought. I've had it before. It's not new information. What would I do if I didn't believe it?" The question at the end is everything. It redirects the mind from defense to possibility, from confirming what you fear to exploring what might be real. The language you use is the life you build. Pay close attention to the words you use when talking to yourself, not the inspirational self-talk you perform consciously, but the real ongoing monologue that runs beneath your awareness. When you make a mistake, what do you say to yourself? When you fall short, what is the story? When you face something difficult, what does your inner narrator tell you about your odds? The language you use in private is not just commentary, it is programming. Every time you call yourself stupid, every time you describe yourself as someone who always does this or never does that, you are strengthening a neural pathway. You are deepening the groove. You are teaching your mind what to believe about you. The good news is that this works in both directions. Language that is deliberately chosen, not pretend positivity, but accurate, expansive, honest reframing, has measurable neurological effects. When you consistently describe yourself as someone who is learning rather than someone who doesn't know, you activate different neural circuits. When you say, "This is difficult and I'm figuring it out," instead of "I can't do this," you keep the door open for the brain to generate solutions. This is not magic. It is neuroscience. The mind is a pattern recognition machine that takes its cues from repetition. Feed it enough repetitions of a new pattern, and it will begin to treat that pattern as normal. Breaking the loop. The most destructive mental loops operate below the level of conscious awareness. They're the background hum of negative self-talk that has become so familiar it no longer registers as noise. It just registers as reality. I'm the kind of person who starts things and doesn't finish them. I always end up alone eventually. Success like that doesn't happen to people in my situation. These loops are self-fulfilling, not because the universe conspires to confirm them, but because you do. When you believe you're the kind of person who doesn't finish things, you subtly underinvest in what you start. When you believe you always end up alone, you unconsciously create the conditions for that outcome. The prophecy is self-fulfilling not because it's true, but because believing it makes it so. Breaking the loop starts with the practice of noticing it, not fighting it, not denying it, simply watching it, the way you'd watch a cloud pass across the sky, with the understanding that you are not the cloud and the cloud is not permanent. There's that thought again. The moment you can observe your own limiting belief rather than inhabit it, you have created the essential space in which change becomes possible. You are no longer the belief. You are the one who has that belief and who can choose to examine it, challenge it, and, eventually, replace it with something more true. Building the new system. Once you've identified a limiting program, the work of replacement can begin. But understand this, replacement is not erasure. The old pathway doesn't disappear. It just becomes less traveled. You're not removing the old road. You're building a new one and choosing to drive on it instead. This requires repetition, It requires consistency. It requires the willingness to keep doing the new thing when the old thing still feels more natural, because it will feel more natural for a long time, because you've been doing it longer. But here is the truth about neural change that will keep you going when the process feels slow. Every single repetition counts. Every time you catch the limiting thought and redirect it, you are doing real, measurable work on the structure of your mind. It accumulates, like interest. The person who has been consistently practicing new thought patterns for 6 months is not just slightly better off than the person who started. They are neurologically, meaningfully different. The grooves run in different directions now. Stay the course. The renovation is underway, even when you can't see it. Purging the poison. Why your environment is either your greatest ally or your greatest enemy. In the fall of 2009, a team of researchers at Harvard published results from a study that would go on to be cited thousands of times in the literature on human behavior. The study tracked the habits, health outcomes, and life trajectories of individuals over several decades, and one of its most striking findings was this: the behaviors, attitudes, and even the emotional states of the people around you are contagious in ways that closely resemble biological infection. Not metaphorically contagious, literally. The neural systems that govern our own emotional regulation, our sense of what's possible, and our beliefs about ourselves are constantly being calibrated by the people we spend the most time with. We are social organisms at the deepest level of our architecture, and our minds are continuously, often, invisibly, being shaped by the minds of those nearby. This is why the company you keep is not a peripheral concern, it is central. The 5 people principle. You have almost certainly heard some version of this idea. You become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's been attributed to motivational speakers and misattributed to philosophers, and by now it has the slightly tired quality of a concept that's been repeated so many times it's stopped being heard. But just because something is over-quoted doesn't mean it's wrong. The influence of our social environment on our beliefs, habits, and self-concept is one of the most robustly replicated findings in social psychology. We mirror the people around us. We absorb their standards. We calibrate our ambitions, consciously or not, to match what seems normal in our immediate circle. If you spend most of your time with people who are sedentary, financially anxious, and resigned about the future, you will find it extraordinarily difficult to sustain the energy, discipline, and optimism required to build something different. Not because you're weak, because you're human, and humans are wired for social conformity at the neurological level. Conversely, spending regular time with people who are engaged, ambitious, and actively building something creates a kind of ambient permission. The implicit message your brain receives is, "This is what's possible. This is what people like me do." And then, gradually, it becomes what you do. The taxonomy of toxic. Before you can make strategic decisions about your social environment, you need to be able to see it clearly, not with bitterness or superiority, neither of those serves you, but with honest assessment. There are several distinct categories of people who drain rather than fuel. The resigned. These are people who have made peace with lives they don't actually want. They've decided that their current circumstances are permanent, that change is too hard or too rare, and that wisdom means learning to want less. They are often deeply kind. They can also be profoundly dangerous to your growth, because their acceptance of limitation can read as wisdom if you're not careful. The drama generators. These people live at the center of constant turbulence. Their lives are perpetually in crisis, not because they're unlucky, but because crisis, at some level, is what they know. Every conversation loops back to problems. Every resolution creates a new complication. Being around them for extended periods consumes enormous psychological resources that you need for your own development. The benevolent crushers. This category is the most insidious because the damage comes wrapped in love. These are the people, sometimes family members, sometimes longtime friends, who genuinely care about you and genuinely want you to be okay, but whose definition of okay is not taking risks that might lead to failure or pain. Every time you move toward something ambitious, they meet you with a story about someone who tried something similar and got hurt. Their concern is real. So is its effect on your courage. The competitors. These are people who are invested, subtly or overtly, in keeping you at their level. Your success represents to them a kind of implicit judgment of their choices. They may not consciously want you to fail, but they are unconsciously relieved when you do. None of these people are necessarily bad, but their presence in your life, in large doses, is a kind of gravitational field pulling you back toward stasis. The content you consume is company too. In the contemporary information environment, the social influence that shapes your mind is not limited to the people you physically spend time with. Every piece of content you consume, every social media account you follow, every podcast you listen to while driving, every news site you refresh compulsively, every comment section you read while telling yourself you should stop, is shaping your neural architecture. The mind, remember, cannot fully distinguish between what is happening to you and what you're reading about happening to someone else. When you spend an hour reading enraging political commentary, your nervous system responds as though you are in a state of political conflict. When you spend an hour scrolling through images of curated perfection, your brain generates the same social comparison signals it would generate if you were physically in a room full of people who seemed more successful than you. The content you consume is a social environment. It has all the same effects on your mind, often concentrated into more potent doses. This means that the person who says they're committed to growth but begins every morning with 45 minutes of divisive news content is not neutral. They are actively working against themselves. What you feed your mind at the beginning of the day sets the neurological tone for everything that follows. What you feed it consistently over time shapes who you are. This is not about avoiding all negative content or creating a bubble of artificial positivity. It's about being as deliberate about what goes into your mind as you are, presumably about what goes into your body. You wouldn't start every morning by eating food you knew was making you sick. Why start every morning by consuming content you know is making you anxious, cynical, or numb? The art of strategic distance. Removing toxic influence from your life does not always mean dramatic exits. Sometimes it means strategic reduction, seeing certain people less frequently, contributing less emotionally to certain conversations, being more selective about what you engage with. This requires skill, not coldness, skill. The skill of protecting your own psychological space while remaining decent and humane, of being less available without being cruel, of redirecting conversations that are pulling you toward resignation without lecturing everyone about personal development. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone. You don't have to justify your choices to people who weren't part of building them. Some relationships will naturally recede as you change, and that is not a failure. It is a calibration. The people who are meant to be in your next chapter will be able to meet you there. They won't require you to stay where you were to feel comfortable. Building the new circle. You cannot simply remove the negative without replacing it with something. Nature and the psyche abhor a vacuum. As you create distance from what diminishes you, actively seek what expands you. Find people who are doing things you want to do, not as objects of envy, as proof of possibility. Every person in your life who has built something real from nothing, who has maintained integrity under pressure, who has kept going when stopping would have been easier, that person is not just an acquaintance. They are living evidence that what you want to do is possible. Protect that evidence fiercely. Seek out communities, online or physical, organized around the version of yourself you are becoming rather than the version you are leaving behind. Let the conversation in your life gradually shift from what's wrong to what's possible. From analysis of problems to construction of solutions. This is not naive optimism. It is environmental engineering. It is the deliberate construction of a context in which your best self can emerge. Because here is the final truth about environment. You cannot build a new identity in the same space where the old one was created. Not entirely. You need new inputs, new models, new conversations, new evidence about what's possible. You need a new neighborhood, internal and external, one that matches the person you are committed to becoming. Seizing control. How to stop being lived and start living. There is a quiet epidemic running through American life that doesn't make headlines and doesn't show up in medical statistics. It is the epidemic of people living lives they did not choose. Not in dramatic ways, not in lives of obvious misery or visible oppression, in quiet ways. The career that seemed reasonable at 24 and turned into a kind of low-grade life sentence. The relationship that became habit long after it stopped being nourishment. The city, the routine, the social role. None of them consciously selected, all of them somehow just accumulated, like sediment. These people are not technically unhappy. They are not in crisis. They are simply absent from their own lives, present in body, running the motions efficiently, occasionally capable of genuine pleasure. But somewhere along the way, the sense that they are the author of their own story was quietly misplaced. If any part of this sounds familiar, this chapter is for you. The invisible abdication. At some point in most people's lives, they make a decision they don't know they're making. They hand the controls to someone else. Sometimes it happens early. The child who is rewarded consistently for compliance and punished consistently for independence learns quickly that other people's approval is more valuable than their own judgment. The lesson calcifies. What others want from me matters more than what I want for myself. Sometimes it happens slowly. The accumulation of small compromises, each one individually reasonable, that adds up to a life that belongs more to the expectations of others than to any genuine desire of your own. And sometimes it happens after a major loss, a heartbreak, a failure, a devastating disappointment, that teaches you, wrongly, that wanting things leads to pain, and it's safer to want less. However it happened, the result is the same. You are living reactively rather than intentionally. Things happen, and you respond. Others want, and you accommodate. The days pass, and you navigate them. But the essential sense of agency, the feeling of I am steering this, is missing. Recovering that agency is the work of this chapter. The blame architecture. The primary structure of a life lived without agency is blame. Blame is not always loud or vengeful. Often it's quiet and almost reasonable sounding. The constant low-level attribution of your circumstances to forces outside your control. The economy, your background, the people who let you down, the opportunities that never came. All of these things are real. None of them are the whole story. And the problem with making them the whole story is not moral. It's practical. When the cause of your circumstances exists entirely outside you, so does the solution. You become a passive recipient of whatever the external world decides to deliver. This is not freedom. This is waiting. The shift from a blame-based worldview to an agency-based worldview is not the rejection of context or the denial of injustice. It is the addition of a crucial question to whatever analysis of your circumstances you're running. Given all of this, what can I do? That question doesn't erase the difficulty. It doesn't make unfair things fair. But it redirects your psychological resources from the past, which cannot be changed, to the present, where action is still possible. And action, even small and imperfect action, begins to accumulate. The internal locus. Psychologists have a term for the belief that you control what happens to you. Internal locus of control. The belief that things happen to you and your job is to react accordingly is called external locus of control. Decades of research have confirmed what common sense would suggest. People with strong internal locus of control consistently achieve more, recover faster from setbacks, report higher life satisfaction, and maintain better physical health. This is not because their lives are objectively better. It's because their interpretation of their lives is more empowering. They see themselves as active participants in their own story, which means they keep generating options where people with external locus of control see dead ends. The good news is that locus of control is not a fixed trait. It is a habit of mind, and habits can be changed. It starts with the practice of asking, in any situation, no matter how constrained, what is within my control here? Not everything, usually not most things, but something, always something. And that something is where you put your energy. Controlling your responses. Here is the deceptively simple principle at the heart of agency. You cannot control what happens. You can always control how you respond. This is not a new idea. The Stoic philosophers built an entire philosophy around it. Viktor Frankl discovered it in the most extreme conditions imaginable, but the simplicity of the principle can obscure how radical its application actually is. When you truly internalize that your response to events is always within your control, when this becomes not just a belief but an operating system, it changes everything. The coworker who dismisses your idea in a meeting can no longer ruin your day because your day is yours to manage. The relationship that ended painfully can no longer define your capacity for trust because that capacity is rebuilt through your choices, not theirs. The failure that still stings can no longer determine your future because the future is being written right now by the choices you're making in response to the failure. This is not emotional suppression. It is not the toxic positivity of pretending things don't hurt. Things hurt. People disappoint. Plans fail. All of this is real, and all of it matters. But the meaning it gets to have in your life, the story you build around it, the way it shapes your choices going forward, that is yours. Choose deliberately. The practice of reclamation. Reclaiming your life requires, first, an honest audit of where you've surrendered it. Where are you living for other people's approval rather than your own values? Where are you tolerating situations that don't serve you out of fear of what happens if you don't? Where have you been telling yourself the story that change is impossible when the real story is that change is uncomfortable? These questions are not comfortable to sit with, but they are necessary because until you can see the places where you've abdicated, you cannot begin the work of returning. Pick one, the smallest one, if that's what's available. The place where the gap between what you're tolerating and what you actually want is narrow enough that you can imagine, however faintly, what it would look like to close it. And then close it. Imperfectly, incompletely. With full awareness that the first step is almost never graceful, because the first step is not about grace. It is about the decisive signal you send to your own nervous system. This is who I am now. I make choices. I act. I am the author here. That signal repeated becomes a belief. The belief embodied becomes identity, and identity is the most powerful force in human behavior. The architecture of discipline, building the system that builds you. There is a word that gets misunderstood more consistently than almost any other in the self-improvement conversation, and that word is discipline. Ask most people what they think of when they hear it, and you'll get images of military training, rigid schedules, joyless grinding. You'll get the image of someone who has eliminated all softness from their life in the pursuit of a goal, who never sleeps in, never takes a day off, never allows themselves the pleasure of an unproductive afternoon. That image is a fiction, and it's a damaging one because it makes the real thing, actual discipline, seem both more extreme and less interesting than it actually is. Real discipline is not punishment. It is not the absence of pleasure. It is the architecture of a life that is aligned with your actual values rather than your momentary impulses. And it is, in the deepest sense, freedom. The two voices. Somewhere around 6:30 every morning, Michael faced a decision. He was a 42-year-old emergency room physician in Chicago, working long shifts, managing a household, and trying to write the novel he'd been carrying in his head for 9 years. He had 30 minutes in the early morning before the day's demands took over, time he could use to write or to scroll, or to sleep another half hour. Every morning he described it the same way. Two voices. One voice said, "You earned this rest. You worked 60 hours this week. The writing can wait." The other voice said, "This is the only time. If not now, when?" Michael said that for the first year, the first voice won most mornings. Then, somewhere in the second year, the balance shifted. By the third year, rolling over to check his phone felt genuinely uncomfortable, a violation of something he'd come to understand as himself. He finished the novel, but the more important thing he built in those morning hours was not a manuscript. It was an identity, the identity of a person who does what they said they would do, even when nobody is watching, even when nobody would know the difference. Discipline as a design problem. One of the most consistently replicated findings in behavioral psychology is that willpower is a finite resource. It depletes with use. The person who spends their psychological energy all day resisting temptation, making hard decisions, and pushing through discomfort will have less of it left by evening. This is why purely willpower-based discipline strategies eventually fail. You cannot white-knuckle your way to transformation. At some point, you run out of grip. The more durable approach is to treat your behavioral environment as a design problem. The question is not, how do I force myself to do this? The question is, how do I make this easy and its absence hard? This means structuring your environment so that the behaviors you want to perform are the path of least resistance. The running shoes next to the bed, the phone in the other room during work hours, the meal-prepped food in the front of the refrigerator, the books on the coffee table where the TV remote used to be. Small structural changes have outsized effects on behavior because they work with human psychology rather than against it. They make the right choice automatic rather than requiring a heroic act of will each time. Design your environment for the person you're becoming. Let the environment do some of the work. The role of routine is discipline's infrastructure. It is what converts individual acts of willpower into automated behavior. And automated behavior is the only kind that is truly sustainable over the long term. Think about the things you do automatically each day. Brushing your teeth, making coffee, the sequence of your morning preparation. These behaviors require virtually no mental energy because they have been automated through repetition. The decision has already been made. The neural pathway is well worn. The body just follows it. This same automation is available for the behaviors that will transform your life. But it requires a different relationship with routine than most people have. Most people think of routine as a constraint, a cage of sameness that limits their freedom. The reframe that unlocks everything is this: routine is the container that creates freedom. When you don't have to decide what to do with your first hour of the day, you can put that decision-making energy toward the things that actually require your best thinking. When you have automated exercise, nutrition, and learning into your weekly structure, you don't have to muster courage each time. You just follow the track. The track does the work. You built the track. Perfectionism is discipline's assassin. Nothing kills sustainable discipline more reliably than the demand for perfect execution. The perfectionist mind operates on a binary. Either everything is being done correctly, or everything has fallen apart and the whole project is ruined. A missed workout becomes evidence of total failure. A day off from writing becomes the beginning of a months-long absence. The imperfect execution becomes grounds for abandonment. This is catastrophic thinking dressed up as high standards, and it is far more responsible for abandoned goals than laziness, weakness, or any of the other villains we typically blame. The principle that actually sustains long-term discipline is radically unglamorous. A bad day is better than no day. The workout that felt terrible still happened. The 15 minutes of writing that produced nothing good still happened. The meditation session that was nothing but distracted thought still happened. Each of these imperfect executions keeps the streak alive. Each one tells your nervous system, this is still what we do. The discipline is not in the quality of any individual execution. It is in the continuity of the pattern. Prioritize the pattern. Obsess over the streak. Let the individual performances be whatever they are. What you don't do, there is a dimension of discipline that rarely gets discussed, and it may be the most important one. Discipline is not only about what you add, it is equally about what you refuse. The commitments you keep to yourself, the lines you maintain when no one would know if you crossed them, the promises you make to your future self and hold when your present self wants to break them. In a culture saturated with options, opportunities, and entertainment, the discipline to say no to unnecessary consumption, to conversations that drain you, to obligations you've outgrown, to the easy substitutes for hard work, may be the most consequential form of discipline available. Every yes to something that doesn't serve you is a no to something that does. Every hour spent on passive consumption is an hour not spent on active creation. Every compromise of your own integrity, however small, erodes the foundation on which your discipline is built. Guard what you refuse with the same intentionality that you bring to what you pursue, because transformation is not only accumulation, it is also subtraction. It is the continuous editing of your life toward greater alignment with who you actually are, and the discipline to keep making those edits, even when addition feels more satisfying than removal. The wisdom in pain, what you lose by running from difficulty. In the summer of 2017, Dr. Aya Nakamura, a grief counselor based in San Francisco with 2 decades of clinical experience, gave a talk that quietly went viral in the mental health community. The title was simple, What We Lose When We Skip the Hard Part. Her central argument was this: the modern therapeutic and self-improvement culture has developed an inadvertent bias toward what she called fast-forwarding, the desire to get through difficult emotions as quickly as possible, to find the insight, the silver lining, the lesson, and then move on before the full weight of the experience has actually been integrated. The result, she argued, is people who are technically functional but fundamentally unhealed, who carry the same wounds in different disguises, who seek help repeatedly for what appear to be different problems but are, at their root, the same avoided pain. Her prescription was counterintuitive. Slow down. Stay longer. The discomfort is not a side effect of the healing process. It is the healing process. The avoidance economy. Pain avoidance is big business in America, not just pharmaceutically, though that is a billion-dollar industry in itself, but culturally, structurally, architecturally. An enormous percentage of human creative energy goes into the production of distraction, entertainment, social media, gaming, consumption, all of it, at some level, designed to give the nervous system somewhere to go other than toward whatever is difficult. There is nothing wrong with pleasure. There is nothing wrong with rest or entertainment or the 100 small comforts that make daily life livable. The problem is not comfort itself. It is comfort as avoidance. Comfort used not to restore a depleted system, but to prevent a necessary confrontation. Because what we avoid does not in fact go away. It waits. The unprocessed grief doesn't dissipate over time. It metabolizes into anxiety, anger, or numbness, transmitted sideways into relationships and work and the body itself, in forms that are harder to recognize and harder to address. The avoided conversation doesn't resolve itself. It turns into resentment or withdrawal or an ongoing undercurrent of disconnection that slowly drains what might have been a genuine relationship. The bill always comes due. The only question is what form it arrives in. Pain as information. Imagine for a moment what would happen to a human body that couldn't feel physical pain. You might assume this would be desirable, a kind of ongoing anesthetic comfort. In fact, there is a rare genetic condition called congenital insensitivity to pain that produces exactly this situation, and it is profoundly dangerous. Without pain signals, the body cannot alert to injury, cannot prompt protective behavior, cannot communicate that something requires immediate attention. People with this condition injure themselves constantly and unknowingly. Their bodies deteriorate faster. Their life expectancy is shortened dramatically. Pain is not a bug. Pain is a feature. It is the body's most urgent communication system. The same is true psychologically. The emotional pain of a relationship that has stopped working is not an obstacle to happiness. It is a signal pointing directly at something that requires attention. The grief that comes after a significant loss is not an inconvenience. It is the mind and body's natural process for integrating the reality of something that has changed permanently. When you run from this pain, you don't protect yourself from it. You trade it for something worse, the unexamined life, the repeated pattern, the endless variation on the same wound in different disguises. When you stay with it, when you sit with the discomfort long enough to hear what it's telling you, you gain something irreplaceable: information, clarity, the kind of self-knowledge that cannot be acquired any other way. The American myth of resilience. There is a story Americans tell themselves about strength that is, at its core, deeply unhealthy. The story goes, strong people don't dwell. They take the hit, get back up, and keep moving. They don't make their feelings a burden for others. They process quickly and move on. Tears are fine in private, but be ready to function by morning. This story produces people who are highly functional and deeply wounded, who have developed impressive capacity for performance while never developing the capacity for genuine healing. Real resilience is not the ability to bounce back without being affected. It is the capacity to be fully affected and then, with time and intention, to integrate the experience and move forward without it becoming a cage. This requires, first, the permission to feel what you feel, not to indulge it, not to cultivate suffering, but to give the emotion the basic respect of being acknowledged. When your best friend loses something important, you don't tell them to snap out of it. You sit with them. You let them grieve. You understand that the grief serves a purpose. that it is moving through them, reorganizing their relationship with what has been lost, preparing them to continue. Be that friend to yourself. For once, be that friend to yourself. What pain has to teach the most important growth experiences in your life almost certainly came dressed as loss or failure or difficulty. The relationship that ended badly, but forced you, finally, to examine what you actually value in another person. The professional setback that closed a door you'd been half-heartedly leaning against and opened the space for something you actually wanted. The period of depression or anxiety that felt unbearable and turned out to be the condition under which you finally sought help, built self-knowledge, developed compassion. This is not the universe being cruel in service of your development. It is not a narrative in which everything happens for a reason. It is simply the nature of human consciousness. We are creatures who learn primarily through experience, and the experiences that teach us most are the ones that disturb our equilibrium. Smooth water produces no sailors. The storm is the teacher. You cannot choose whether difficulty comes. You can choose how you relate to it, and the quality of that relationship, whether you meet difficulty with avoidance or engagement, with bitterness or curiosity, determines everything about what you carry out the other side. Grief as gateway. There is a specific form of pain that deserves particular attention because it is the one most systematically avoided in American culture: grief. Not only the grief of bereavement, the loss of someone we love, which culture at least recognizes as legitimate, but the broader grief of any significant ending. The end of a version of yourself, the loss of a life you thought you were going to have, the slow fade of a dream you held for years. These losses are real, they are significant, and they are almost never adequately mourned. Instead, we are encouraged to move on, to find the silver lining, to focus on what's next. The message is, getting stuck is weakness. Progress requires forward motion, but grief is not stagnation. It is movement, internal movement, the deep reorganization of the self around a new reality. To refuse to grieve is not to keep moving. It is to freeze in place while pretending to walk. The people who have done the deepest work of personal transformation, who have genuinely left old versions of themselves behind and built something new, have almost always passed through real grief. Not the performed mourning of a social media post, but the actual gut-level reckoning with what they are losing as they change. Because change is loss. Even when you're gaining something vastly better, you are also losing what was. And that loss deserves to be honored. Honor it. Give it the space it's asking for. And then, when you've moved through it rather than around it, you will find yourself standing in a new country, one where the old weight is gone and the new capacity has been earned. The vow of loyalty to yourself. What it means to finally keep your own promises. Think about the last promise you broke. Probably not a promise to someone else. Those most of us take seriously. Social contracts, obligations to others, commitments made in public. These carry weight because the consequences of breaking them are visible. People notice. There are social costs. Now think about the last promise you broke to yourself. The morning you hit snooze on the workout you'd committed to. The conversation you kept telling yourself you needed to have and kept postponing. The project you announced internally with real conviction that you were finally going to start and then didn't. How long ago was that? Hours? Days? We are, most of us, remarkably reliable to the people around us and remarkably unreliable to ourselves. We show up for others' deadlines and routinely miss our own. We honor commitments made in public and treat commitments made in private as optional. This asymmetry is destroying your relationship with the most important person in your life, yourself. the private ledger. There is a record being kept that no one else can see. Every time you tell yourself you're going to do something and then don't, your brain logs it. Not always consciously, but neurologically, in the accumulated pattern of your own behavior toward yourself. The trail of followed-through commitments and abandoned ones builds up over years into something that functions like a credit score for your relationship with your own word. When that score is low, when the record shows a long history of promises made and broken, the effect on your self-concept is corrosive. You stop trusting your own intentions. You begin to discount your own commitments before you've even made them. The inner voice that says you're going to do this is answered by another voice, even quieter but more devastating. No, you're not. You never do. This quiet self-disbelief is one of the most destructive forces in human psychology, and it is almost entirely self-inflicted. The mechanics of self-trust. Self-trust is built the same way external trust is built, through consistency, over time, between words and actions. The good news is that it can be rebuilt, even if the record is poor. Even if you have, for years, been someone who regularly fails their own commitments. The mechanism is simple, though not easy. Start making small promises to yourself and keeping them, not the grand transformation commitments that have failed before. Small ones, micro-commitments. Tomorrow morning I'm going to get up when the alarm goes off. This week I'm going to read for 15 minutes before bed. Today I'm going to make the difficult phone call. And then do those things exactly as you said. Each kept commitment is a deposit. Each one contributes to the ledger of evidence that says, when I say I'm going to do something, I do it. Over time, this evidence reshapes the operating assumption from which all your other behavior flows. The person who keeps small promises to themselves starts to become, by accumulation, someone who keeps large ones. The public versus private standard. One of the most profound reframings available in personal development is this: the truest test of your character is not how you behave when others are watching. It is how you behave when no one is watching. Not because what you do in public doesn't matter. It does. But because your private behavior is what actually constitutes your character, the real one, beneath the performed one. Consider the person who is meticulously professional in their work life, but consistently dishonest in their private self-talk, who shows up reliably for others, but chronically fails their own commitments, who presents with confidence in social situations, but privately maintains a running commentary of self-doubt and self-dismissal. The gap between public self and private self is a source of profound psychological fragmentation. The energy required to maintain it is enormous, and it tends to widen, not narrow, over time, as the private self becomes more beaten down and the public self becomes more performative to compensate. Closing that gap, bringing the private standard up to meet the public one or even surpassing it, is one of the most transformative projects a person can undertake. Begin by treating yourself with the same reliability you bring to your professional commitments. Give your private promises the same weight you give your public ones. You deserve at least that much from yourself. Loyalty under pressure, the ultimate test of self-loyalty, is not what you do when life is easy. It's what you do when it's hard, when you're exhausted and the commitment feels heavy, when you've been working toward something for months and the progress is invisible, when the old version of yourself is whispering, with genuine persuasiveness, that you were better off before, when things were simpler. These are the moments when everything you've been building either holds or breaks. And here is what experience shows. People who have built genuine self-trust, who have a real record, however imperfect, of keeping their own word, are far more likely to hold in those moments. Not because they have superhuman willpower, but because they have something more durable, a clear sense of who they are, and a commitment to acting accordingly. I am someone who follows through. That's not a goal. It's a fact. And this moment is part of the pattern. That identity-level commitment is what gets you through the hard morning, the difficult conversation, the months of invisible work. Build it incrementally. Protect it fiercely. It is the foundation of everything. Self-compassion and self-loyalty are the same thing. There is a misconception worth addressing, that self-loyalty means being hard on yourself, that it requires a kind of internal drill sergeant punishing every deviation from the standard. This is precisely backwards. The most productive relationship you can have with yourself is one of firm, compassionate accountability, the kind a skilled coach has with a developing athlete. High standards held with genuine belief in the person's capacity. Honest feedback delivered with care. A clear distinction between the performance was not what we aimed for, and you are not who we thought. The internal critic who responds to every missed commitment with a cascade of contempt is not keeping you accountable. It is teaching your nervous system to associate your own goals with shame. And then it's surprised when you start avoiding your goals. Be disciplined. Be consistent. Hold yourself to genuine standards. And also, be kind. Not soft. Kind. There is a difference. The kind of kindness that says, I know this is hard. I'm not going to let you off the hook because I believe in what we're building. And I'm not going to destroy you for being human because that's not how this works. That voice, firm, caring, honest, is the voice you are trying to grow. It takes time. It takes practice. It takes the willingness to treat yourself as someone worth the effort. You are. Redefining yourself. You are not the roles you've been given. There is a version of you that exists in other people's minds. In your parents' minds, you are probably still, in some deep register, the child they watched grow up, carrying the traits they identified early, the potential they hoped for or worried about, the patterns they saw form. In your oldest friends' minds, you are likely still, in some respects, the person you were when you met them. Whatever age that was, whatever version that was. In your own mind, you are probably a composite, part current reality, part accumulated story, part ambition, part limitation, all of it layered together in ways that are sometimes coherent and sometimes contradictory. Here is the truth that none of these versions capture. You are not fixed. You are a process, a developing thing, a story still being written by the choices you make today and tomorrow, and in the long accumulation of ordinary days that constitute a life. The most important question you can ask yourself is not who am I? It is who am I becoming? And the most important insight that follows from that question is this: you have more influence over the answer than you may have been led to believe. The labeling problem. From the earliest moments of your life, people have been applying labels to you. Some were explicit. She's the smart one. He's the sensitive one. You're so athletic. You're not a math person. Others were implicit, transmitted through patterns of praise and criticism, through what was celebrated and what was corrected, through the roles you were assigned within your family and social systems. These labels, repeated often enough, become identity, not because they were accurate, but because they were early, and the young mind is exquisitely responsive to external definition. The problem is not the labels themselves. Some of them may even be accurate or at least not harmful. The problem is the reification, the process by which a repeated description of a behavior becomes a fixed assessment of a person. The crystallization of you sometimes do this into this is who you are. Identity crystallization is the prison most people don't know they're in. The walls are invisible because they're made of things that feel true. The self-descriptions we've been using for so long, they no longer feel like descriptions at all. I'm an anxious person, not I experience anxiety in certain contexts. I'm lazy, not I struggle with motivation when I don't connect clearly to my purpose. I'm just not a morning person, not I haven't yet built a morning routine that works for me. The difference between these formulations is not semantic, it is the difference between a permanent condition and a circumstance that can be changed. The identity? Mo pivot. When people talk about behavior change, building new habits, breaking old ones, they typically focus on actions and outcomes. What you do, what you achieve. The researcher Brené Brown and others have pointed to what may be a more fundamental layer, the identity that underlies the behavior. The story you're telling about who you are. The person who is trying to exercise regularly but describes themselves as not athletic is fighting their own self-concept with every workout. The person who wants to write consistently but describes themselves as someone who always procrastinates is undermining their efforts before they begin. The pivot that changes everything is the shift from I want to become someone who does this to I am someone who does this. Not as a lie, not as pretend, but as a chosen operating assumption, the claim you stake about your identity and then set about proving through your behavior. I am a writer, not I'm trying to write more. I am someone who takes care of their health, not I'm trying to work out more. I am a person who follows through on commitments, not I'm working on my discipline. The language shift is real work, not wordplay. When you claim an identity, your behavior begins, gradually, to conform to it. When you frame yourself as becoming, you give yourself permanent permission to remain in the gap, unlearning what was installed. Part of the work of self-redefinition is the careful examination of what has been installed in you by others, particularly in the formative years, that is limiting your current development. This is not blame work, it is archaeology. You're not looking for someone to hold responsible. You're looking for the source of a pattern so you can examine whether it still serves you and choose, consciously, whether to keep running it. The parent who told you that you weren't academic, were they right, or were they working from limited data filtered through their own experience? The teacher who told you that you weren't creative, were they seeing you clearly or projecting their own biases? The friend who said you'd never be the kind of person who could sustain a business, were they offering wisdom or working out their own ambivalence about their own choices? Most of the limitations you accept about yourself were installed by people who were, at best, imperfect observers working from incomplete information. They may have loved you, and they may have been wrong. You are allowed to examine the record. You are allowed to decide which parts to keep and which to release. You are also allowed to be the revision. Becoming in public. One of the subtle challenges of identity transformation is social. When you change, genuinely change, the people who knew the old version of you are often uncomfortable with it. Not maliciously, but change in someone else is unsettling in ways that are hard to articulate. It challenges the stability of their own identity. It raises questions they might not want to sit with. If she can change that fundamentally, what does that mean about me? The result is that the people who love you most may, paradoxically, be among the most consistent sources of pressure to remain who you were. They will call it concern. They may say, "You seem different lately. Are you okay? I feel like I don't know you anymore." And you will be tempted to soften the change, to perform the old version for their comfort, to manage their anxiety by contracting yourself. Don't. This is not cruelty. Maintaining your new identity in the face of social pressure to revert is an act of deep self-respect. The people who genuinely love you, the ones whose love is not conditional on you remaining unchanged, will adjust. They may take time, but they will find you. The ones who can't accept your growth were loving a version of you, not you, and that was never what you needed anyway. Meeting your shadow, the hidden power in what you refuse to see. Every person carries two stories, the one they tell the world and the one they hide from themselves. The story told to the world is the curated one, the highlight reel, the professional bio, the version you'd give if someone asked you to describe yourself in a job interview or on a first date. It emphasizes strengths, frames weaknesses as growth edges, maintains a coherent and reasonably flattering narrative. The hidden story is more interesting. It contains the impulses you don't act on but feel, the resentments you'd be ashamed to admit, the jealousies that arise and get immediately suppressed, the moments of smallness you hope nobody saw, the parts of yourself that don't fit the self-concept you've spent years constructing. In Jungian psychology, this hidden story is called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is simply unexamined. It is the parts of the self that have been pushed into the psychological basement because at some point they were deemed unacceptable, too aggressive, too needy, too selfish, too competitive, too something. The critical insight is this: what you push into the basement does not disappear. It waits, and in waiting, it gathers force. How the shadow operates. The unexamined shadow does not stay quietly in the basement. It seeps. It seeps into your reactions, particularly your strong, disproportionate reactions to things that shouldn't, rationally, bother you that much. The person who triggers an irrational fury in you is often doing something that your own unacknowledged shadow wants to do. The behavior you find contemptible in someone else is frequently something you secretly desire and have forbidden yourself. This is the mechanism Jung called projection, attributing to others what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The person who is deeply critical of greed in others while quietly harboring their own unexamined avarice. The one who cannot stand vanity in someone else while spending enormous energy on their own image. The shadow doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as judgment of others, as righteous anger, as principled objection. And so it goes unrecognized, which means it goes unexamined, which means it continues to operate without your awareness. The gift inside the monster here is what makes shadow work transformative rather than merely uncomfortable. The shadow contains not only the rejected darkness, but also the rejected light. Consider the person who was taught throughout their childhood that assertiveness was aggressive and therefore unacceptable, that expressing needs was imposing on others, that conflict was dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. This person's shadow likely contains enormous amounts of suppressed strength, clarity, and directness, qualities that were judged as too much and pushed underground, along with the things that were genuinely problematic. When they do shadow work, when they begin to examine what they've hidden and allow it into consciousness, they don't only uncover difficult impulses. They also uncover capacities they desperately need. The confidence to advocate for themselves, the clarity to name what they actually want, the strength to hold a position under pressure. The shadow contains your rejected gifts alongside your rejected wounds. This is why encountering it is not only confronting, it is also, in the deepest sense, freeing. The practice of integration, shadow integration, is not about indulging every impulse you've suppressed. It is not permission to act on whatever dark thing you've been avoiding. It is something subtler and more important. It is the practice of owning what you feel rather than being covertly controlled by it. The first step is permission. Permission to feel the feeling without acting on it and without condemning yourself for having it. I feel jealous of this person's success. Not, I should feel happy for them, and shame on me for not feeling happy for them. I feel resentful of this obligation. Not, I'm a terrible person for not wanting to do this. The feeling is information. What is the jealousy telling you? Probably that there is something about this person's situation that maps onto a desire you haven't been allowing yourself to acknowledge. What is the resentment saying? Probably that a boundary has been overstepped or a value is being compromised. Receiving the information, engaging with it rather than suppressing it, is the work. Shadow and relationship. One of the most immediately practical applications of shadow awareness is in your closest relationships. The partner who makes you inexplicably furious is often doing something that your shadow self desperately wants to do. The friend who makes you feel vaguely threatened may be expressing a version of yourself that you've suppressed. The family member whose behavior you find intolerable may be acting out the traits you've worked hardest to hide in yourself. This doesn't mean they're not actually behaving badly. Sometimes they genuinely are. But the strength of your reaction, the disproportionate charge of it, is your shadow's fingerprint on the situation. When you can recognize that fingerprint, you gain the ability to respond rather than react. To ask, why does this hit me so hard? What does that tell me about something I haven't been willing to look at in myself? This inquiry is humbling. It is also one of the most powerful relational tools available because it transforms judgment into curiosity, and curiosity almost always leads to greater connection. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of yourself that has been waiting, in the dark, for you to be ready to welcome it home. The silent revolution, reclaiming your mind in the age of noise. You are reading this at a moment in history when the capacity for sustained independent thinking is more valuable and more under threat than at any previous point in human civilization. This is not hyperbole. The technological infrastructure of the contemporary information environment is specifically designed by teams of the most talented engineers and behavioral scientists in the world with access to the most sophisticated understanding of human psychology available to capture and hold your attention, not for your benefit, for theirs. Every notification, every algorithmic feed, every infinite scroll is a lever. You are being pulled by hundreds of levers simultaneously, all day, every day. The vast majority of these levers are pulling you away from independent thought and toward reaction, toward consuming content, generating engagement, producing data. Against this backdrop, the ability to think your own thoughts, clearly, independently, sustained over time, is not a given. It is a hard-won practice. It must be protected, cultivated, and defended. Your mind is the most important thing you own. Its quality will determine the quality of every decision you make, every relationship you build, every ambition you pursue or abandon. You cannot afford to outsource it. The architecture of thought. Consider how much of what passes through your mind on a given day is actually yours. The opinion you expressed at dinner, was it a position you arrived at through genuine reflection? Or was it something you absorbed from a source that confirmed what you already believed? The anxiety you felt scrolling through the news, was it a response to an actual threat, or was it manufactured by an algorithm that has learned that anxiety drives engagement? The aspiration you felt while looking at someone else's curated highlight reel, was it genuine desire? Or was it comparison-generated inadequacy performing as desire? Much of what we experience as our own thinking is, in fact, borrowed, absorbed from environment, amplified by algorithm, shaped by the social dynamics of whichever platform we happen to be logged into. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural vulnerability. The human mind was not designed to navigate this particular environment. We evolved in conditions where information was sparse and scarce, where the things your brain needed to track were immediate, local, and physically present. The contemporary information environment is the cognitive equivalent of trying to navigate by stars while standing in Las Vegas. The signals are too many, too bright, and too deliberately engineered to serve someone else's purpose. The practice of reclaiming your mind begins with the recognition that this is the environment you're in, and it requires active countermeasures. The practice of mental hygiene. Mental hygiene is exactly what it sounds like, the maintenance of your psychological environment through deliberate attention to what enters it. This means curating your information diet. What do you consistently read, watch, and listen to? What are the cumulative effects of those inputs on your emotional state, your worldview, your sense of possibility? If the answer to that last question is more anxious, more cynical, more passive, you have a hygiene problem. Protecting your attention. Attention is finite and precious. Every decision you make, every relationship you navigate, every ambition you pursue will be done with the quality of attention you bring to it. Guard what depletes it. Protect what restores it. Creating regular space for independent thinking. This can be walking without earbuds, writing in a journal without agenda, sitting with a difficult question and staying with it long enough to have an actual thought rather than immediately reaching for your phone to search for someone else's answer. The goal is not a perfectly curated mental environment. It is the active, ongoing practice of taking some ownership over what occupies your mind. Thoughts are not facts. One of the most liberating insights available in psychological development is also one of the simplest. A thought is not the same as a fact. This sounds obvious until you notice how rarely you actually operate as though it were true. The thought, "I'm going to fail at this," treat it as a fact, so you don't try. The thought, "Nobody takes me seriously," treat it as a fact, so you don't speak up. The thought, "I'm not the kind of person who can do that," treat it as a fact, so you never find out whether it's true. The practice of cognitive diffusion, treating thoughts as mental events rather than accurate reports on reality, is one of the most evidence-based interventions in modern psychology. It is also one of the most practically powerful. The thought appears. You notice it. You recognize it as a thought, an event in the mind, not a window on the world. And then you ask, what would I do if I didn't assume this thought were true? That question opens space. In that space, choice becomes possible. In that space, transformation begins. The long game. Everything in this book has been pointing toward a single insight, and that insight is this: who you become is not determined primarily by what happens to you. It is determined by how you respond to what happens to you. And your response capacity is determined above all by the quality of your thinking. Upgrade the thinking, and you upgrade the response. Upgrade the response, and you change the trajectory. Change the trajectory, and over years, over decades, in the long accumulation of small chosen differences, you change the life. This is not quick work. The culture of instant results and rapid transformation has done enormous damage to our collective ability to sustain the kind of long-term, consistent effort that genuine change requires. We expect internal transformation to happen on the time scale of external change. It doesn't. It can't. But here is the truth about long games. They end, and when you play them well, they end somewhere extraordinary. The version of you that began reading this book, whoever they are, whatever they're carrying, is not the version that needs to reach the end of the road. That person is in process. They are becoming. They are, right now, in the crucial in-between of shedding who they've been and building who they will be. That process is not clean. It is not linear. It will involve setbacks that feel like failures, pauses that feel like retreat, moments of such total disorientation that you can't remember why you started. But you do remember. because it's right here at the beginning of this book in the reason you picked it up. You are tired of being the old you. You are ready to meet what comes next. The death has already begun. What rises from it is up to you. Conclusion. The birth. You have arrived here carrying something. Perhaps it is the quiet certainty that the version of yourself you've been maintaining has run its course. Perhaps it is the accumulated weight of a pattern you've watched play out one too many times, the same fear in different clothing, the same retreat wearing different reasons. Perhaps it is something simpler and more primal, the sense that you have more to give, more to be, more to become than the life you've been living has allowed. That something is not a problem to be solved. It is a signal to be honored. The old you, the one built from other people's definitions, from years of quiet compromise, from the slow accumulation of avoided discomforts, is not a failure. They were a chapter. They brought you here. They provided the contrast without which you would never have understood what you actually want. But they have served their purpose, and it is time to let them go. What comes next is not a finished person. Transformation does not have a destination. It has a direction. The direction is toward greater authenticity, greater capacity, greater alignment between who you are on the inside and how you move through the world. You will still have hard days. You will still, sometimes, hear the old voice. You will still find yourself in weak moments reaching for the comfortable lie. This is not failure. This is the long game. The measure of transformation is not the absence of difficulty, it is the changing of your relationship to difficulty, the gradual shift from "I can't handle this" to "I've handled hard things before, and I will handle this," from "this might break me" to "this might build me." That shift is already underway. It began the moment you decided to take seriously the possibility that the old you doesn't have to be the final you. The story is not over. In fact, the most important chapter is the one you're about to begin writing. Every morning is a choice. Every day is a draft. Every small decision, to do the thing or avoid it, to speak the truth or soften it, to act from your values or your comfort, is a word in the text of who you are becoming. Write it well. Write it honestly. Write it as though the reader who matters most, your future self, looking back, deserves the best version of this story you're capable of telling. The old you has been buried. The eulogy has been read. The flowers are already fading. Now stand up. Walk out into the sun. You are no longer who you were, and you are only beginning to discover who you are. About this book, The Death of the Old You is a guide for anyone ready to stop performing a version of themselves that no longer fits, and to begin, with honesty and intention, the serious work of becoming who they actually want to be. It draws on the principles of cognitive psychology, behavioral science, and the lived experience of transformation to offer a clear-eyed, unsentimental roadmap for personal reinvention. It does not promise quick results. It promises something more valuable, a genuine framework for lasting change. For those who are tired of the gap between the life they're living and the life they know they're capable of, this book is for you.